Here is a continuous written account of the case, structured for a 50-minute read. In the early hours of March 19, 1985, a quiet residential street in Garden Grove, Southern California, became the scene of a murder that would take years to fully unravel. At the center of it was a family whose carefully maintained image of normalcy concealed layers of manipulation, abuse, and calculated deception orchestrated by one man, David Arnold Brown. David Brown was 32 years old at the time, a self-made success story in the computer industry who had founded his own data recovery business and accumulated considerable wealth. To those outside his home, he appeared to be a devoted family man, a provider, and a charming personality. The reality was something far darker. David had a compulsive need for control that extended to every person in his orbit, particularly the women and girls he surrounded himself with, whom he systematically isolated, groomed, and manipulated to serve his purposes. On the evening of March 18th, David's parents came over to the family home on Ocean Breeze Drive for dinner and cards. The household at that time consisted of David, his 23-year-old wife Linda, their 8-month-old daughter Ashley, Linda's 17-year-old sister Patty Bailey, who had lived with the couple for years, and David's 14-year-old daughter from a previous relationship, Cinnamon, who had moved in just 6 months earlier. The home was crowded, tense, and increasingly fractured. Cinnamon had recently been moved out of the main house into a trailer in the backyard after Linda said she no longer wanted her inside. Cinnamon resented this bitterly and had grown moody and withdrawn in the preceding months. That evening, she and Linda had another argument, with harsh words exchanged on both sides. After David's parents left around 9:30 in the evening, Linda showered and went to bed. David, Patty, and Cinnamon watched television for a while before David retired around 11 p.m. Patty and Cinnamon went to Patty's room, where Cinnamon sometimes slept on a trundle bed. Patty noticed that Cinnamon seemed burdened, as though she wanted to say something but couldn't bring herself to do it. They stayed up watching MTV for a while, but Cinnamon remained guarded. Eventually, Patty went to sleep. Shortly after, Cinnamon came back into the room holding a small handgun, asking Patty how to operate it. Patty, not fully understanding the weight of what was happening, told her she wasn't certain, but that from what she had seen on television, you pulled back the hammer and pulled the trigger. Cinnamon thanked her and left. Sometime after midnight, David got out of bed, left the house, and drove his Honda Prelude out into the quiet streets of Garden Grove. He stopped at a convenience store, bought an apple pie, a Dr. Pepper, and 4 comic books, then drove aimlessly before stopping at a Denny's restaurant to use the bathroom. He was gone for more than an hour. When he returned home, he found his sister-in-law Patty standing in the living room, trembling and clutching baby Ashley. At 3:25 in the morning, David called 911 and told the dispatcher that either his wife or his daughter, or both, might be dead. Police arrived within minutes. A patrol officer made his way through the house to the main bedroom and found 23-year-old Linda Brown lying on her back in bed, her t-shirt and the sheets beneath her soaked with blood. A Smith & Wesson .38 caliber snub-nosed revolver lay on the carpet beside the bed. Paramedics were summoned and found Linda still had a faint pulse and was drawing shallow, labored breaths. She was rushed to Fountain Valley Community Hospital, where she died less than an hour later from 2 gunshot wounds to the chest. 1 bullet had pierced the superior vena cava, the large vein that carries blood from the upper body to the heart. Cinnamon was nowhere to be found inside the house. Officers searched the property inside and out. A police helicopter swept low over the street with a spotlight, and neighbors were knocked up and questioned. No one had seen or heard anything significant. Then, just after dawn, a detective placing a small dachshund puppy in the backyard kennel noticed something odd, a white tennis shoe poking out from the opening of one of the doghouses. He bent down and looked inside. There was Cinnamon, curled in the fetal position, barely conscious, her clothes covered in bright red vomit, the floor of the doghouse dotted with pill capsules and reeking of urine. Clutched in her hand was a piece of pink cardboard with a red ribbon tied around it, on which she had written in childlike handwriting, "Dear God, Please forgive me. I didn't mean to hurt her." She was brought to the police station, where she drifted between consciousness and incoherence. Tested and photographed, she eventually told Detective Fred McLean that she had shot Linda. She said Linda had threatened to kill her if she hadn't left the house by morning, and that she had acted out of fear and anger. She described firing 3 shots, one accidentally in Patty's room while trying to figure out the weapon, and 2 into the main bedroom where Linda was sleeping. She said the gun belonged to her father and that she had found it in a drawer. She then described crawling into the doghouse with the note in her hand before losing consciousness. Medical testing revealed she had taken a massive overdose of Darvocet, a prescription painkiller, and a diuretic used to treat high blood pressure. In total, she had consumed 3 bottles of her father's prescription medication, a dose containing more than 6 times the fatal amount of the opioid propoxyphene. Only her body's violent rejection of the drugs through repeated vomiting had saved her life. Cinnamon was charged with first-degree murder and booked into Orange County Juvenile Hall. Because she was 14 years old, California law required that she be tried by a judge rather than a jury, and that she could not be prosecuted as an adult. At trial, she pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, claiming to have no memory of the shooting. A psychiatrist testifying on her behalf stated she was suffering from psychogenic amnesia and dissociative disorder. The prosecution rejected the insanity plea, arguing she was a depressed and angry girl who had carefully planned the killing. Patty testified about Cinnamon's deteriorating mental state and her behavior in the lead-up to the shooting, including the incident with the gun the night before, though her testimony was notably cautious and she stopped short of making certain identifications. David did not attend the trial, citing illness from a liver disorder, and his testimony was submitted by stipulation. Both sides agreed that David believed Cinnamon was guilty. The judge found Cinnamon guilty of murder with premeditation and deliberation. After hearing from multiple psychiatrists, who found her too grounded to be psychotic but too emotionally troubled to function normally, the judge concluded she had been sane at the time of the killing. She was sentenced to 27 years to life in a juvenile correctional facility with the possibility of early release in as little as 6 years if she remained a model inmate. She burst into tears as she was led away. Cinnamon settled into life at the California Youth Authority in Ventura. She attended school, earned good grades, held a part-time job, sang in the church choir, and was regarded by staff as cooperative and pleasant, though she kept largely to herself and refused to engage in counseling. She was, in every outward sense, a model prisoner. Her father visited regularly in the early period of her incarceration, reassuring her he was working to get her out and funding her commissary account. But over time, the visits became less frequent. David cited poor health. When Cinnamon called the house, her grandparents usually answered and said David wasn't around. When he did visit, the meetings were brief, and he consistently instructed her to keep insisting she remembered nothing about the night Linda was killed. In December 1986, 14 months into her sentence, Cinnamon told her examiners something that caught their attention. Her paternal grandfather, Arthur Brown, had recently visited her alone, the only time he had done so without David present, and had told her that he was sure he knew who had really planned Linda's murder. This remark reached detectives Jay Newell and Fred McLean, who had worked Linda's case and had never entirely accepted the official narrative. There had always been aspects of the crime that troubled them. David's behavior in the aftermath of the shooting had been strange. He had refused to enter the bedroom to check on Linda after returning home, calling his father before calling 911 and telling the dispatcher he was too afraid to look. This was at odds with the typical response of a spouse or family member who would usually rush to check on the victim and attempt first aid. During the initial investigation, David had mentioned having sex with Linda that evening, but her autopsy found no evidence of recent intercourse. He had also asked Patty, a 17-year-old girl, to go outside alone in the middle of the night to search for an armed fugitive, rather than doing so himself. At Linda's funeral, he had hissed at the minister and gestured for him to stop, when the minister noted that the marriage had sometimes been rocky, causing the minister to return to the pulpit and correct himself, declaring the marriage had been almost perfect. And at Cinnamon's sentencing, David had flirted openly with his ex-wife, pulling her hair playfully, showing no grief or concern for his daughter's fate. Furthermore, Cinnamon's own diaries, recovered by investigators, contained nothing that suggested hostility toward Linda. They were lighthearted scribblings about music, friends, and everyday activities, entirely inconsistent with the portrait of a girl building toward a calculated murder. Detective Newell decided to visit Arthur Brown privately. He found him living with David in a lavish Anaheim Hills home, a far cry from the modest bungalow in Garden Grove that David had told Cinnamon was a downgrade. The house was a sprawling blue-green stucco and fieldstone manor on a quiet, tree-lined street in one of the county's most exclusive neighborhoods, complete with a triple garage, swimming pool, hot tub, and manicured lawns. Newell discovered it had been paid for in cash, using life insurance money collected after Linda's death. Early in the investigation, David had told police that Linda only had one small life insurance policy. In reality, he had taken out 4 policies on her life. In total, he had collected more than $842,000, the equivalent of roughly $2.5 million in today's money. He had used the money to buy expensive cars, fund gambling trips to Las Vegas, and construct the life of luxury he now enjoyed. Newell waited until David's car was out of the driveway before approaching Arthur. The older man was visibly nervous, but agreed to speak briefly. When pressed about what he had told Cinnamon, Arthur said that 2 weeks before Linda's murder, he had been in the car with David, Linda, and Patty Bailey when Linda got out to use a bathroom. While she was gone, he overheard Patty say she wanted to get rid of Linda in order to save David, claiming that Linda was plotting with her twin brother Alan to kill him and take over his business. Arthur said it had taken him more than 5 months after the murder to fully recall the conversation due to the shock he was in. He was adamant that Cinnamon was not fully responsible for what happened. He said he had told her he felt he knew who had planned the whole thing because he had heard her say she was going to do something to save David. When Newell pressed for a name, Arthur glanced anxiously over his shoulder and said quietly, "Patty." At that moment, David's car pulled into the driveway. Panic crossed Arthur's face. He muttered that if he stuck his neck out too far, he would lose his son, his granddaughter, and another grandchild. Newell, thinking quickly, introduced himself to David as a real estate agent named Jerry Walker. The 3 men made small talk about property values before Newell quietly left. David, remarkably, did not recognize one of the detectives who had investigated his wife's murder less than 2 years earlier. Newell also spoke with Cinnamon's paternal aunt, Susan, who had encountered Detective McLean after Cinnamon's sentencing hearing in the courthouse car park. Susan said that the last time she had spoken with Linda, it was clear she was miserable. She told McLean that the tension in the Brown household was not primarily caused by Cinnamon, but by Patty. She said Cinnamon had been moved out to the trailer not because of Linda, but because Patty didn't want to share her room. She described Patty as having a smug expression whenever Cinnamon was in trouble, and said Patty always got her way with David. Most alarmingly, Susan said Linda had confided in her that she found Patty dangerous, so much so that she never allowed Patty to care for the baby alone. She had told Susan that Patty was acting strangely and that she was very worried about her. And ever since Linda's death, Patty and David had become inseparable. Newell believed there was considerably more to this case than the courts had been led to believe. But he had a significant obstacle. Because Cinnamon was still a minor, he was not permitted to approach her without her guardian's consent, and her guardian was David Brown. Newell resolved to wait until she turned 18. For 3 years, he monitored David's affairs, kept track of his business dealings, and maintained close watch on Cinnamon's progress in the correctional facility. The moment Cinnamon turned 18 on July 3, 1988, investigators made their move. Newell contacted her and laid out what they had found. The 4 life insurance policies, the enormous payout, the lavish Anaheim Hills home, the luxury cars, the Vegas gambling trips. And then, during surveillance of the property, Newell had witnessed something that gave him the final piece he needed: David Brown, locked in a passionate kiss with Patty Bailey. Cinnamon initially refused to believe any of it. She loved her father. She believed he was fighting for her. But Newell kept returning, bringing photographs of David and Patty embracing, documentation of the insurance policies, proof that the dose of pills she had been given the night of the murder should, by any medical calculation, have killed her. The evidence accumulated until it could no longer be ignored. And there was something else she had been trying to suppress. Months before Linda's murder, she had herself witnessed a kiss between David and Patty. She had tried to push it from her mind. Now, with everything Newell was showing her, she could no longer do that. On August 10th, 1988, Cinnamon called Detective Newell and said she wanted to talk in person. What she told him shattered any remaining doubt about David Brown's guilt. In the months after Cinnamon had moved into the Garden Grove home in September 1984, she said that Patty had come to her and David with a story. Standing in the doorway of the kitchen, Patty told them she had overheard Linda on the phone with her twin brother, Alan, saying she needed to get him out of the way. Cinnamon thought it was a joke, but David took it seriously, or more precisely, David used it. Over the days and weeks that followed, he approached Cinnamon repeatedly, telling her Linda was going to try to kill him. When Cinnamon asked why he believed this, he told her not to worry about it, that he just knew. He claimed Linda and Alan wanted him gone so they could take over his business and properties. Cinnamon suggested divorce. David refused, saying even if they divorced, Linda would come after him anyway, and that she knew too much about his proprietary computer methods and would set up a competing business. Then came the threat that would prove most effective of all. David told Cinnamon he was thinking of leaving, of walking away from the family entirely and starting over somewhere else. The prospect of her father abandoning her was more than the teenager could bear. She begged him not to go. David replied that he had to, unless, he said, they could find a way to get rid of Linda. Over the following months, he encouraged Cinnamon and Patty to compete for his approval by devising ways to kill her. They discussed running Linda over with the van, pushing her out of it, hitting her over the head, electrocuting her in the bath, until someone pointed out that Linda only took showers. On the day before the murder, the family had planned a trip to the desert for target shooting, the intention being for someone to shove Linda off a cliff, but the trip was canceled due to rain. Whenever Cinnamon wavered, David asked her, "Do you love me? Would you do anything for me?" And then, when she reaffirmed her love, he told her that the only way to truly prove it was to kill Linda. He told her she was the perfect person to do it because at 14, she couldn't be charged as an adult. He assured her that if she staged a suicide attempt afterward, the juvenile system would simply send her to a psychiatrist and release her back home. He had her practice writing a suicide note. On the evening of March 18th, after his parents had left, David told Cinnamon that it had to happen that night. He said the situation had become urgent, that Linda was planning to kill him any day. Cinnamon began to cry. Linda and David went to bed. The house alarm was activated, so Cinnamon couldn't go to the trailer without triggering it. She and Patty went to Patty's room. They had almost fallen asleep when David appeared and woke them. He told them to get up. They had to do it now. He had deactivated the alarm and taken Cinnamon to the back of the house, where he had prepared a cocktail of pills, 2 or 3 bottles worth. Cinnamon was alarmed by the quantity. David reassured her it was just enough to make her sick and make the suicide attempt look convincing. She swallowed them. David showed her how to hold a small brown pillow against the barrel of his handgun to muffle the sound. He told her to shoot Linda twice, in case the first shot didn't work, warning that if Linda survived, she would separate the family. He also told Cinnamon she should shoot herself lightly afterward to add weight to the staged suicide. Then he left the house. Patty handed Cinnamon the loaded gun. Cinnamon went to the main bedroom where Linda was asleep and fired through the pillow. The hammer caught in the fabric. She panicked and ran back to Patty's room, where the two of them freed the weapon, but it discharged accidentally in the process, the shot that fired into the wall of Patty's room. From the bedroom, they could hear Linda moaning. Patty told Cinnamon to go back. She returned to the bedroom and fired once more before dropping the gun and stumbling outside. The pills were already working. She made her way to the doghouse, lay down in the fetal position with the suicide note in her hand, and lost consciousness. She had no idea the dose David had given her was potentially lethal. The detectives sat in silence as Cinnamon finished her account. They had suspected something more was at play, but the full scope of David's cold manipulation of his own daughter was devastating. They knew they needed evidence, and Cinnamon agreed to help gather it. When David failed to visit on her birthday, she called and insisted there was something urgent she needed to discuss in person. He agreed to come the following weekend. On August 13, 1988, David arrived at the Youth Authority prison in Ventura. The two sat at a picnic table beneath a pine tree. Cinnamon was wearing a wire. When she told him she was thinking of telling the authorities the truth about Linda's murder, David worked frantically to manage her. He offered a scattered story about Linda being involved in drugs and owing money to dangerous people. He said Patty would confess and take her place. He tried to cast himself as a victim, claiming he had always believed Patty was the real killer and that he had only told Cinnamon to take the blame because he was afraid of Patty. He deflected questions about the pills he had given Cinnamon and urged her again and again to keep insisting she couldn't remember anything. He told her he couldn't survive in prison and that he would kill himself before dying a slow, painful death in a cell. 2 weeks later, Cinnamon asked both David and Patty to visit together. They arrived and spent the meeting trying to convince Cinnamon that she was confused or misremembering. They denied knowledge of nearly everything she described, but eventually, Patty offered to take the blame, telling Cinnamon that if she was in there for nothing, then Patty would go in for nothing too. David made enough incriminating statements about the pills and his instructions to Cinnamon to confirm the investigator's case. He did not realize any of it had been recorded. On September 22, 1988, Detective Newell led a team to the Anaheim Hills home and arrested both David and Patty. Under questioning, David held his story for 2 hours before being confronted with the photographs and recordings. His demeanor shifted immediately. He began spinning a new version, that he had always been afraid of Patty, that she was the one who truly killed Linda, that he had only guided Cinnamon to protect himself. But the recordings told a different story entirely. In the other interview room, the investigators laid everything out for Patty and told her what David was saying, that he was putting it all on her. For the first time in her life, Patty began to see clearly. David had entered her life when she was 8 years old, living next door to the Bailey family in Riverside. He had ingratiated himself with the family by offering to pay the girls to clean his house, under the pretense that he was dying of cancer and unable to manage the chores himself. He sat Patty on his lap and told her how pretty and intelligent she was. She was a child from a troubled home, already vulnerable from sexual abuse by a family relative. The attention from David made her feel special. What began as inappropriate touching escalated to full sexual abuse. When Patty moved into the Brown household at 11, David had complete access to her. He convinced her that if she wanted to develop into a woman, she needed to perform oral sex on him, calling it entirely natural. When her body later began to change, she believed he had been telling the truth. By the time she was 15, he had begun raping her. If she resisted, he told her a million other girls would love to take her place. If she refused outright, he threatened to send her back to her mother's house. He told her no one would ever like her for herself, only if she did as he said. He had also promised to marry her one day, despite already being married to her older sister. He had started planting seeds about killing Linda not long after Patty moved in. He had once, during a drive back from a shooting trip, looked at the gun in Patty's lap and said with a smile that it would be funny if it went off and shot Linda. Over the years, the comments continued. One night before Cinnamon had even moved in, David woke Patty, handed her a gun, and told her to shoot Linda in her sleep. Patty went to the bedroom doorway. She stood there with the gun, looked at her sleeping sister, and could not do it. She loved Linda. She put the gun down and walked away. David later roped her into his scheme differently, not as the trigger, but as a manipulator of Cinnamon. In July 1986, just 16 months after Linda's murder, David and Patty had secretly married in Las Vegas. He was 34 and she was 18. It was his sixth marriage. They concealed their relationship even from David's parents, who lived under the same roof. When Patty became pregnant, David invented a story about a man named Doug who had fathered the child and abandoned her, allowing David to play the role of generous benefactor to the unwed teenager. After the baby was born, he refused to be named on the birth certificate. He told Patty that if people knew they were together, they might suspect them in Linda's death. When Patty finally understood the full extent of how David had used her, and how readily he was now prepared to sacrifice her just as he had sacrificed Cinnamon and Linda, the last of her loyalty collapsed. In October 1988, 1 month after her arrest, she chose to cooperate fully with authorities. Her account of events leading up to and including the night of Linda's murder matched Cinnamon's in every detail. She had not been offered immunity before agreeing to testify. Patty pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to 4 years in a juvenile correctional facility. The discrepancy between her 4-year sentence and Cinnamon's 27-year sentence reflected both their different degrees of culpability and the timing of their cooperation with authorities. Patty's testimony was essential in building the case against David. While awaiting trial, David, ever calculating, hatched a new plan. In jail, he befriended a fellow inmate named Richard Steinhardt, a former outlaw motorcycle gang member with ties to the criminal underworld. David told him he had $500,000 buried in the desert and offered $10,000 per victim if Steinhardt would murder 3 people: Patty Bailey, Detective Jay Newell, and Deputy District Attorney Jeffrey Robinson. He reasoned that killing the prosecutor and the detective would force new personnel onto the case, which he could exploit by demanding a speedy trial, and eliminating Patty would remove the prosecution's star witness. He arranged for $600 to be left in his car's glove compartment so Steinhardt could buy weapons after release. He also wanted his own house and motorhome burned to suggest he was being targeted. What David didn't know was that a fellow prisoner had already overheard the early conversations and reported them to authorities. Steinhardt had agreed to become an informant before any of the killings took place. Police recorded 25 to 30 phone calls between David and Steinhardt, in which David discussed the planned murders with the casual ease of someone arranging a business meeting. When Steinhardt told him on the phone that both Robinson and Newell had been killed, David's response was simply, "All right." He then had his brother Tom, who had no idea what the money was for, deliver $11,000 in cash to Steinhardt. Tom Brown, upon learning the truth, told investigators he no longer considered David his brother. The supposed hit woman arranged to be placed in Patty's prison was in fact an undercover police officer. David was charged with additional counts of conspiracy to commit murder, arson, and perjury. His trial began in the Orange County Superior Court in spring 1990. The prosecution built its case on recorded conversations, testimony from Cinnamon and Patty, the insurance policy documentation, and Steinhardt's account of the murder-for-hire plot. The defense called almost no witnesses. David did not take the stand. On June 15, 1990, after less than 7 hours of deliberation, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder with the special circumstance of financial gain and conspiracy to commit murder. At sentencing, the judge told him, "Mr. Brown, you're a scary person. Look what you did to your own children, to your sister-in-law. It's scary to think you can manipulate people and do all this and not bat an eye." He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In 1992, after serving 7 years of her 27-year sentence, Cinnamon Brown was paroled at the age of 21. The assistant district attorney who had prosecuted the case remarked that the real story was the courage of a 14-year-old who had been completely brainwashed by her father, who had herself been the victim of terrible crimes, and who had now paid more of a debt to society than she should have. Cinnamon found work in the travel industry and married in 1994. She spoke publicly of her remorse for Linda's murder. Despite everything Linda had endured in that household, she had cared for Cinnamon in ways that only became clear in hindsight, defending her against David and treating her with the kindness of a mother. Cinnamon said that Linda's death was the most painful thing she carried, not just because of the guilt, but because she had loved her and killed her anyway, because her father had told her to. David Brown died in prison on March 22, 2014, at the age of 61, of natural causes. He never expressed remorse. Linda Brown's daughter, Ashley, was raised by her paternal grandparents and told for years that her mother had died in a car accident. She later discovered the truth through a library book. She has spoken about growing up without a mother and about what it means for her own children not to have the grandmother she never had. Patty Bailey was released at 25, changed her name, remarried, and won custody of the daughter she shared with David. She spoke in later years about the weight of what she had done, about Linda, and about the impossibility of going back. Cinnamon, too, has carried the truth of that night for the rest of her life. The knowledge that the one person she would have done anything for was the one person she never should have trusted, and that his greatest victim was not Linda, but every child he ever claimed to love.